The morning came in gray and slow, the way mornings do in late October, when the mountains hold the darkness a little longer than the valley wants. Frost had settled overnight across the boards of the porch, and the pines along the ridge stood perfectly still, not a branch moving, as though the whole forest was holding its breath. Ruth Callahan stood at the edge of that porch with a rifle resting in the crook of her arm. She was not aiming it. She was not scanning the tree line in the nervous, darting way of a woman who has heard something alarming. She stood the way a person stands when they have already made their decision and are simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. Her gray eyes moved across the ridge once, slowly the way a man reads a familiar page. Then she looked down at the frost on the boards beneath her boots. She pressed the toe of one boot into it and watched the white bloom darken. She said something then quietly to no one that anyone could see. "There you are," she said. "Finally." Then she turned and walked inside and put the rifle on its rack and put the kettle on the stove. Cedar Bluff, Wyoming territory sat in a shallow bowl of land between two ridges, the kind of town that had not yet decided whether it intended to grow or to quietly disappear. There was a general store run by a man named Harv Osgood, who had kind eyes and a talent for remembering what his customers needed before they asked. There was a church with a crooked steeple that the congregation had been meaning to fix for 4 years. There was a sheriff's office where Emmett Dale spent most of his mornings, drinking coffee and reading whatever newspaper had made it out from Cheyenne, usually 2 weeks late. And there was a saloon called the Silver Spur, where men gathered in the evenings to do what men have always done when the work is done and the dark comes early. Ruth Callahan had lived in Cedar Bluff for 3 years. She paid her bills on time. She was polite when spoken to and quiet when not. She brought eggs to old Mrs. Fenwick when the woman's hip kept her from the market, and she had once helped pull a wagon out of a ditch on the Laramie Road without being asked. The people of Cedar Bluff had over those 3 years arrived at a comfortable understanding of her. She was a widow. She had come from somewhere back east after her husband passed. She kept to herself, but was decent about it. She was the kind of person you felt glad to have in a community without ever wondering too deeply about the particulars. None of them had noticed the things that were worth noticing. The window frames in her cabin had been refitted at angles that should not have made architectural sense. Not until you understood that each one gave a clear line of sight to a different approach without the person looking out ever having to stand directly in front of the glass. The vegetable garden on the south side of the cabin was laid out in a pattern that any passing eye would read as ordinary, but which also happened to break up the sight lines of anyone trying to move quietly from the tree line to the back door. The barn, which she used as a stable for one horse, sat exactly far enough from the cabin that the space between them could be crossed in 4 seconds at a run, but not without being visible from 3 of the 4 cabin windows for every one of those seconds. And on the inside wall beside the kitchen table, mostly hidden behind a row of preserves jars and a calendar 2 years out of date, there was a map. It was not a decorative map. It was a working document covered in marks made in 3 different colors of ink, applied at 3 different times, annotated with distances and notations that would have meant nothing to most people and a great deal to the right ones. It was the kind of map that gets made by someone who has learned through long and specific experience that the difference between surviving a situation and not surviving it is almost always a matter of knowing the ground better than the person coming at you. Ruth Callahan knew the ground. She had known it the way she knew it now, with a completeness that had become so natural it was almost invisible since the war. But that was not something Cedar Bluff knew about her. That was not something Cedar Bluff needed to know. She had come here with a purpose, and the purpose was not to disappear. That was the thing about Ruth Callahan that the people of Cedar Bluff had entirely understandably and quite usefully gotten wrong. They saw a widow choosing solitude, and they were sympathetic to it because solitude after loss is a thing most people have felt the pull of at one time or another. What they did not see was that she had chosen this particular place, this particular cabin, on this particular ridge, for reasons that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with geometry. The ridge gave her elevation and visibility. The single road in and out of her property gave her control over approach. The distance from town, 12 miles by the main road and rather more by any other route, gave her enough time to prepare for anything she saw coming. And she had seen this coming for a long time. 3 years ago, her husband Martin had been found at the bottom of a ravine 7 miles north of Cedar Bluff. The official account was that his horse had shied at something in the dark and thrown him. The coroner, a man named Watts, who kept a second ledger of payments from Silas Pruitt's land office, had signed the death certificate within an hour of the body being found. Martin had been a federal land agent assigned to the Wyoming Territory to investigate irregularities in the property filings of the past 15 years. He had been exceptionally good at his job. He had been, in the language of men like Silas Pruitt, a problem that had needed resolving. Ruth had known the moment she received the telegram that it was not an accident. She had known it the way a person knows something when every piece of evidence that could prove it has been carefully removed, and yet the shape of what happened is still perfectly visible if you know what shapes to look for. She had come to Cedar Bluff 6 weeks after Martin's death. She had bought the cabin from a family moving north. She had begun quietly and without fanfare to work. She had spent the first year learning the territory, the second year building her position, the third year waiting for the moment that the pressure on Silas Pruitt would become great enough that he would stop being careful and start being desperate. That moment, she had calculated some months ago, was now. She was cutting wood behind the cabin on the Tuesday afternoon when she first became aware of Delia Marsh. She heard the hammering before she saw anything, a rhythmic and frustrated sound coming from the direction of the Hewson place, which had been empty for better than a year since old Caleb Hewson had moved in with his daughter's family in Rawlins. Ruth finished splitting the log she was working on and then walked the quarter-mile through the pines to the edge of the Hewson property and stood at the tree line and looked. A young woman was on the roof of the cabin. She was maybe 19, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of lean, work-hardened build that came from years of outdoor labor. She was trying to replace a rotted section of roofing, and she was doing it wrong. Not dangerously wrong, but wrong in the specific way of someone who has been taught the result she wants and left to figure out the process on her own. She had the angle of the boards off by enough that the first hard rain would pour straight through the gap she was trying to close. Follow the wood down and come in at the follow the wood down and come in at the joint. The young woman looked up. She had the expression of someone who does not particularly enjoy being told she is doing something wrong, which is to say she looked exactly like every person Ruth had ever met. "I know what I'm doing," she said. "I don't doubt that you're trying," Ruth said. "I'm saying the physics disagree with you." There was a moment where the young woman on the roof weighed her options and apparently concluded that her options were limited. She came down off the roof with more grace than Ruth had expected, which was the first useful piece of information about her. Her name was Delia Marsh. Her family had farmed a parcel 12 miles to the east until 8 months ago, when a combination of a poor harvest, a debt, called in by a man at the Cedar Bluff land office named Garver, who worked for Pruitt, and a fire in the equipment barn that everyone agreed was suspicious, had forced her father off the land. Her father had gone to find work in Cheyenne. Her mother was sick and staying with relatives. Delia had come to the Hewson place because it was empty and because she needed somewhere she was not a burden to anyone. Ruth listened to this without interruption. She had learned long ago that the most useful thing you can do when a person is telling you something important is to not fill the space. When Delia had finished, Ruth picked up the hammer, climbed to the roof, and showed her where the boards needed to sit and at what angle and why. They worked for the better part of an hour without speaking much. When it was done, Ruth climbed down and looked at the result and judged it adequate. "Come by Thursday," she said. "I have more work than I need." Delia looked at her steadily. "I don't take charity." "I know," Ruth said. "I'm offering work. There's a difference." She walked back through the pines to her cabin without waiting for an answer. She was fairly certain Delia would come. People who do not take charity are usually people with a clear enough understanding of their own circumstances to recognize when an offer is honest. She was right. Delia came on Thursday. The market day in Cedar Bluff was Saturday, and Ruth made the ride into town with the regularity of a woman who needed to buy flour and coffee and the occasional length of rope. She played the part of an ordinary widow with the ease of long practice, which is to say, she did not play it at all. She simply existed within it while her mind was doing something else entirely. Harv Osgood was glad to see her, as he always was. He was a good man, the kind who had come to the frontier because he believed in the possibility of it, rather than because he had no other options, and who had been consistently proven right by the experience. He called her by name, and asked after her horse, and told her the weather was going to turn by the end of the month. While she moved through the store selecting her goods, she listened. This was not something she did with any visible effort. She had learned in another life, in another part of the country, during a war that had been terrible, and clarifying in equal measure, that the most reliable form of intelligence is the kind that people provide freely, when they do not know anyone useful, is paying attention. Small towns were extraordinary sources of this kind of intelligence. People talked because talking was how human beings processed their world, and in a small town there were not so many people to talk to that you could afford to be selective about the audience. She heard from a rancher named Aldous Briggs who was arguing genially with Osgood about the price of salt, that the Crane outfit had burned out another homestead 2 nights ago, the Whitfield place east of the river. The family had gotten out, their livestock had not. She heard from 2 women near the bolts of cloth whose conversation she moved adjacent to without acknowledging that Sheriff Dale had ridden out to look at the Whitfield site and come back looking worried. He had sent a telegram to Cheyenne, but did not expect much from it. And she saw sitting at the far end of the bar at the Silver Spur, which she passed on her way back to her horse, 2 men she did not recognize. This was in itself unremarkable. Cedar Bluff saw travelers. What was remarkable was the way they sat. They had positioned themselves with their backs to the wall and their faces to the room, which was a habit so specific and so involuntary in the people who had it that Ruth could identify it from 20 yards away. They were watching everyone who came through the door, not with the relaxed interest of curious men, but with the focused patience of people who had been told to watch for something specific. She did not look at them directly. She noted them in her peripheral vision, catalogued their approximate ages and builds, and the particular way the taller one held his right arm slightly away from his body, which suggested a holster worn for cross-draw, and she walked onto her horse. On the road back, she took the long way, the route that climbed to the high ground above the valley before descending toward her ridge. She had a reason for this. At the top of that climb there was a stretch of open ground where anyone traveling the road was visible from the surrounding timber for a full half-mile. She moved through it slowly and without looking into the trees. If anyone was watching, she wanted to be seen. That evening, Ruth ate alone as she always did. There was 1 plate on the table, 1 cup of coffee, 1 chair pulled up to the eating position, and 1 more cup empty sitting on the other side of the table where no one sat. She had not consciously decided to keep that 2nd cup there. It had simply remained from the first morning after she arrived, when she had made 2 cups out of habit and then stood for a long time in the kitchen, holding one of them and looking at the other, and had eventually set the second one down on the table and sat down with her own and drunk it. And then the next morning she had done the same, and then the morning after that. And now 3 years into her life in this cabin, the 2nd cup was as much a part of the furniture of the evening as the lamp or the map on the wall. She looked at it sometimes the way you look at something that has been there so long it has become invisible, and then look at it again and see it clearly. Tonight, she looked at it clearly. "They sent someone ahead," she said. Her voice was even conversational, the voice of a person reporting facts. "2 men in town, watchers. That means the main group is already close, probably staged somewhere in the timber east of here." She drank from her cup. "The Whitfield burning tells me they are done trying to be subtle. That's Pruitt's pattern when a deadline is approaching. He stops being careful and starts being fast." She set the cup down. "The Federal Commission. They passed the Land Investigation Act in August. The commission comes in March, 5 months." She paused. "That's why now. That's why this winter, this month. He has to have this land cleared and the records clean before a federal team starts asking questions that his bought judge cannot answer for him." Outside the wind had picked up. She listened to it for a moment, gauging it the way a sailor reads the sea. "Martin," she said. The name sat differently in the air than the other words had. heavier, softer, both at once. I know you would tell me to be careful. You would say that I have planned well, but that planning is not the same as surviving, and that I should account for the things I have not accounted for. She looked at the empty cup for a long time. I have tried to account for everything, but there is one thing I still cannot find, the final piece, the piece you hid and did not tell me about. She stood and carried her plate to the basin. I will figure it out. You always said I was better at this than you were. I think you were being modest, but I intend to prove you right anyway. She put out the lamp. In the darkness of the cabin, she moved to the bedroom window and looked out at the ridgeline where the pines were black shapes against a sky full of cold stars. Somewhere out there in the timber, two men were probably already watching this window, watching the lamp go out, making note of the time. Ruth stood at the edge of the window where no light could reach her and looked back at the darkness and felt nothing that resembled fear. She found the tracks on Wednesday morning. She had not gone looking for them. She had gone out early with the pretense of checking the water in the northern stock tank, which occasionally developed a slow leak where the boards met the stone foundation. It was the kind of chore that gave her a reason to move slowly along the northern edge of her property at dawn, with her head down and her attention apparently on the ground, which was exactly the posture she needed. The tracks were where she expected them to be, which was to say in the place she would have chosen if she had been the one sent to watch this cabin. A flat shelf of ground behind a deadfall oak elevated enough to see over the garden fence far enough from the tree line to use the pre-dawn darkness as cover for arrival and departure. Whoever had made them had been careful. The impressions in the soft earth were deliberate weight distributed forward to minimize depth, the kind of care you see in a trained scout. But they had made two small mistakes. The first was that they had come from the north, which was the efficient route, but which had required crossing a section of ground where the soil moisture from the creek drainage made it softer than it looked. The track leading away was deeper on the left heel, which told Ruth that the person was carrying something on their left side and had not adjusted for it. A scabbard probably with a longer blade than they were accustomed to wearing in the field. The second mistake was the ash. Tucked behind the far end of the deadfall, barely visible under a piece of loose bark, was the stub of a cigarette. It was old enough to have been there since yesterday, which meant the watcher had arrived the previous evening and stayed through the night. A full night of observation. That level of commitment was not typical of ordinary hired men. That was the patience of someone with a specific purpose. Ruth stood and looked at the cabin from the watcher's position. She could see the kitchen window, the front door, the path to the barn, and the corner of the porch where she sat each morning with her coffee. She could see everything that would allow someone to establish her routine completely in a single night. She looked at all of it for a moment. Then she bent down and very carefully replaced the piece of bark over the cigarette stub exactly as she had found it. She straightened up, brushed her hands on her coat, and walked back to the cabin at the same unhurried pace she had maintained throughout. She fed the horse. She brought in a load of wood. She made breakfast. She did all of it at exactly the same time and in exactly the same order as she did every morning. They needed to believe that she did not know they were there, and she needed them to believe it until she was ready for them not to. Thursday, Delia came as she had been coming. She was better than Ruth had initially estimated. She worked hard and she asked questions when she needed to, and she did not ask questions when she did not, which is a rarer quality than it sounds. She had a good eye for structural problems, the kind of intuitive spatial reasoning that could be trained into precision with patience. Ruth had been thinking about how to use the afternoon when Delia arrived at the porch with a cloth bag of early parsnips from the small plot she had managed to get into the ground before the cold came. "I was in town yesterday," Delia said, setting the bag down. "Heard some things." Ruth waited. The Crane outfit was seen on the Benton Road coming from the north. 6 men, maybe more. The people who saw them said they were not stopping, not looking for work. Just moving. Ruth looked at her steadily. "When did you hear this?" "Yesterday noon, from Aldous Briggs. He came into Osgood's looking for the sheriff." "And did he find him?" "He did. Dale went out to have a look." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Delia, do you know the Hewson place well, the floor?" The question came from nowhere apparent, and Delia looked slightly confused by the shift. "I suppose. I've been living on it." The corner by the kitchen stove. There's a loose board there." Delia's expression changed slightly. She had the look of someone who had filed a piece of information away as unimportant and was now being asked to retrieve it with a different value attached. "There was. I fixed it 2 weeks ago. The board was rotted through." Ruth kept her voice entirely neutral. "Was there anything underneath it when you pulled it up?" Delia thought. Genuinely thought, with the particular focus of a person going back through memory carefully. There was some old cloth and a piece of paper. It was damp and nearly stuck together. I thought it was rubbish. I put it in my coat pocket to burn later." She paused. "I am not sure if I burned it or not. I may still have the coat." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Keep the coat. Don't look at the paper. Don't show it to anyone. And do not go back to your cabin tonight." Delia started to ask something. Ruth shook her head once gently and Delia stopped. "I will explain what I can when I can," Ruth said. "Right now, I am asking you to trust me on something that I do not have time to fully explain." Delia regarded her for a long moment with those dark, frank eyes. Then she nodded. The single nod of someone who has enough experience of serious situations to know when a serious person is speaking seriously. "All right," she said, "go into town tonight. Stay at the boarding house. Tell Mrs. Osgood you are helping me with work and needed to be closer in. She will not ask more than that." Delia left an hour before dark, and Ruth stood on the porch and watched her ride the tree-lined trail north until she was out of sight. Then she went inside and stood at the kitchen table for a time, with her hands flat on the surface. A piece of paper, damp, left under the floorboards of a place Martin had been seen passing through on the last known journey of his life, according to the account of a farrier in Rawlins who had shot his horse that week. She had searched that cabin once in the first year, but she had been looking for something complete, something whole and legible and obvious. She had not lifted every board. She had not been thorough enough. Martin had always been more careful than she gave him credit for. She pulled her chair out and sat down. From the inside pocket of her coat she took a folded letter, very old, creased with the permanent creases of something that had been opened and closed many times. She did not unfold it. She just held it. It was the last letter Martin had sent before he died. There was a line near the end of it that she had read perhaps 200 times and understood only partially. "If something should prevent me from finishing what I have begun," he wrote, "know that I have been careful to leave the most important things where they will be safe and where you specifically will be able to find them. You know me better than anyone living. Trust that." She had trusted it. For 3 years she had trusted it while searching everywhere she could think to search. She folded the letter and put it away and thought about a damp piece of paper in a coat pocket in a boarding house in Cedar Bluff. Trust that. She did not sleep that night. Not because she was frightened. She had stopped being frightened of the dark and of the things in it a very long time ago, in a part of her life that she did not speak of, and that had nevertheless shaped everything about how she moved through the world. She did not sleep because sleeping was not what the night required. She put the lamp out at the usual hour. Then she moved through the cabin in complete darkness, which presented no obstacle to her because she had spent 3 years learning it as thoroughly as she had ever learned anything. She knew every board that creaked, and how much weight it took to make it creak and how to distribute herself around that weight. She knew the exact angle at which the bedroom door could be left to give her a reflected view of the kitchen window from a position behind the interior wall. She knew where each of her weapons was, and what condition each one was in, and exactly how long it would take her to reach any one of them from any room in the cabin. She settled into the chair beside the front window, which was a position she had spent considerable time making comfortable for long use. The rifle lay across her knees. The night outside was clear and cold and very quiet. At some point after midnight she heard horses. Far off to the northwest, the sound there and then gone as the wind shifted, which told her they were taking the ridge trail and not the road. You take the ridge trail when you do not want to be seen on the road. You take it at night when you do not want to arrive in the light. She did not move. She breathed slowly and counted. They were earlier than she had expected. The main group, not just the watchers. She sat in the darkness of her cabin and listened to the Wyoming night settle back into silence around the sound of men trying to be quiet, and she felt something that was not quite calm and not quite readiness, but something in the register between the two. The feeling of a long-prepared thing finally arriving at its moment. In her coat pocket was a letter. She had written 2 letters that afternoon, folded and sealed them both. The first was addressed to Sheriff Emmett Dale. She had sent it with the afternoon rider who came through twice a week, the one who carried mail to Cedar Bluff and the outlying properties. Emmett would have it by now. The letter said what it needed to say, and no more. She had given him a signal to wait for and a time not to come before, and an instruction about Silas Pruitt that she trusted him to follow. The second letter had gone to Judge Aldous Theriot in Cheyenne, a man whose reputation for independence from territorial politics she had verified through 3 separate sources over the course of 2 years. That letter contained a careful summary of what Martin's investigation had uncovered and a request that the judge make himself available to receive formal documentation before the end of the month. She had not told Theriot everything. She had told him enough that if something happened to her, the shape of the thing would exist somewhere official before it could be erased. She sat with the rifle across her knees and the darkness around her, and thought with the clarity that comes in moments of absolute commitment about what Martin had been trying to leave her. He had been a federal man with a meticulous mind and a knowledge that people with the authority to search were coming for him. He had needed to hide something in a way that it could not be found by his enemies and could be found by her. He had chosen a place that would seem random to anyone else and was not random at all, because he knew her, knew how she thought, knew how she would search. She had been searching from the outside in, looking in the obvious places, then the less obvious, then the remote. She had not thought to look in the places where the answer had to be kept close enough to reach. A piece of paper under a rotted board, in a cabin on the route he had taken, left at a place she would eventually pass. Trust that. She pressed her back against the chair and looked at the ceiling and felt the night pressing in from all directions and the weight of 3 years of patience sitting on her chest like something physical, and she breathed through it. Outside in the dark timber, men were moving into position around her cabin. She could not hear them anymore. They were good enough to be silent now that they were close, but she knew they were there. Let them come, she thought. Let them settle into their positions and satisfy themselves that the lamp was out and the widow was asleep and the ground was theirs. They had no idea whose ground this was. In the morning they would find out. She reached into her coat and touched the folded letter she had kept, not the one she had sent to Dale, but the one from Martin, the one with the line she had read 200 times. She did not take it out, just held the shape of it through the fabric. Then she put both hands back on the rifle and settled in to wait for the dawn. The frost on the porch boards would be thick by morning. She had noted that detail when she stood out there in the gray light before the sun had fully committed itself, looking out at the ridge and saying the 2 words that she had been waiting 3 years to say. She had known, standing there, that they were already in the trees, had known it from a change in the quality of the silence that most people would not have noticed and that to her was as clear as a spoken announcement. She had known they were watching her stand there with a rifle in the crook of her arm, watching her press the toe of her boot into the frost, watching her turn and walk inside without haste or alarm. She had wanted them to see that. She had wanted them to see a woman entirely unafraid, moving through her morning with perfect calm. And she had wanted them to take that observation back to the man who had sent them and say, "She does not know. She is comfortable. This will be easy." There was a lot that Silas Pruitt did not know about the woman who had come to Cedar Bluff 3 years ago and built her life in the shadow of his empire. He did not know her name before she became Ruth Callahan. He did not know what she had done during the war, or what she had learned doing it, or what kind of patience that learning had built into her at a level below conscious thought. He did not know that she had been waiting for him as deliberately as he had been looking for reasons to move against her. He thought she was a problem that had sat quiet long enough to be safely ignored and had now become urgent because of external circumstances. He thought she was a widow in a cabin with a rifle and a dead husband's unfinished business. He did not know that every single thing she had done in Cedar Bluff for 3 years had been aimed at this week. The cabin at the edge of the ridge, with its strangely angled windows and its carefully positioned garden, and the map behind the preserves jars, was not a woman's refuge. It was a position. A constructed, deliberate, painstakingly prepared position chosen for its sight lines and its approaches, and the way the morning light would fall across the clearing to silhouette anyone moving from the timber. Ruth Callahan sat in the dark and waited and listened to the clock on the mantelpiece mark the hours toward dawn, and she was not afraid of what morning would bring because she had built the morning herself. She had not come to Cedar Bluff to hide. She had come to finish what Martin started. And tonight, after 3 years of preparation, after 1,000 cold mornings and quiet evenings and careful conversations and slow, patient accumulation of knowledge and position and readiness, the thing she had been building toward was walking into the space she had made for it. She thought of Martin. She thought of the letter under the floorboard that Delia had nearly thrown away without knowing what it was. She thought of how close the whole enterprise had come to being dismantled by a piece of rotted wood and a woman who needed somewhere to live. She thought, trust that. Outside the window the stars were still out, still cold, still indifferent. Inside the cabin Ruth Callahan held her rifle and waited for morning and did not sleep and was not afraid. That was the first thing the men in the timber had gotten wrong about her. It would not be the last. The 3 days before they came were the quietest days Ruth Callahan had known in Cedar Bluff, and she understood that to be the nature of the thing. Silence before violence is not absence. It is accumulation. It is the way a river looks perfectly calm above a falls that will tear a boat to pieces the surface, giving nothing away about the force moving beneath it. She used the quiet well. The morning after she heard the horses on the ridge trail, she rose at her usual hour and did her usual things, and allowed whatever eyes were still watching from the timber to record the ordinary rhythms of an ordinary woman living her ordinary life. She fed the horse. She split wood. She made 2 trips to the barn that took slightly longer than they needed to because she was using the time to move certain items from one position to another without making any gesture that could be read as preparation. The eastern window of the cabin had always had a loose hinge on the lower shutter. She had built that looseness into it deliberately 2 years ago, using a hinge pin filed down just enough that the shutter would hold against normal weather but fail under sustained lateral pressure. From the outside, the window looked like a liability, a point of entry, the kind of thing a man with intelligence would note on his reconnaissance and report back as an option worth using. What the man would not see was the bar that sat in a bracket mounted to the interior wall, a bar that could be dropped into place in less than 3 seconds, turning the window from an apparent weakness into a fixed point of resistance that would throw back exactly the force applied to it. She checked that bracket on the second morning. It was solid. She moved on. The trapdoor mechanism beneath the rear hallway was a simpler construction, a section of flooring 20 inches by 30 that sat flush with the surrounding boards but rested on a pivot rather than being nailed into the joists. The weight of a person standing on it at its forward edge would tip it down and away in a controlled fall of about 3 feet into the root cellar below, where the landing was packed earth rather than stone. Survivable, painful, disorienting in the way that a sudden fall in darkness is always disorienting, which was the point. A man who has just dropped through a floor in the dark and landed on his hands and knees is not a man who is thinking about what he came to do. She oiled that pivot on the second morning. She made no other changes to it. The rest of the time she spent on things that looked like nothing from the outside. She reread certain sections of the notebook she kept in the locked drawer of the kitchen sideboard, the notebook that documented in her own compressed shorthand the full account of Martin's investigation and her own subsequent 3 years of continuation. She reviewed the map on the wall with the particular focused attention of someone checking a calculation before committing to it. She slept in short intervals and woke easily and lay in the dark listening to the Wyoming night, with the patience of a woman who had once spent 60 hours in a frozen barn outside Richmond, Virginia, waiting for a single moment to act. Cedar Bluff thought she was a quiet widow. She had been trained by a war. Delia came on the second afternoon as she had been asked to. Riding in from Cedar Bluff on the little paint horse, she had acquired through some arrangement that Ruth had not asked about because it was not her business. She came up the cabin path at a walk, her eyes moving across the property, with a new quality of attention that Ruth noticed immediately. She was looking at the layout of things differently than she had before. The garden, the barn, the angles between them. She was starting to see the way Ruth saw, which was something Ruth had not explicitly taught her, and which suggested that the girl was absorbing more than she was being told. That was worth knowing. They worked together through the afternoon ordinary tasks, stacking wood and patching a section of fence along the north run. While they worked, Ruth talked, not about what was coming, not directly, but about the principles that governed how she thought about the ground she occupied. She talked about sight lines and the importance of knowing what you could see from where you stood. She talked about the difference between cover and concealment, a distinction that most people never thought to make. Cover stops bullets, concealment only stops eyes. Knowing which one you have is the kind of thing that keeps you alive. Delia worked and listened. She did not ask questions during the teaching, which was the right instinct. Questions could come after. When the lights started to go, Ruth stopped stacking wood and looked at the sky for a moment. "There is something I want to show you before you go," she said. She walked Delia around the exterior of the cabin at a slow pace, stopping at each window. She did not explain everything. She was not teaching the girl to defend this specific cabin. She was teaching her to look at a building the way a thinking person looks at it, to see the relationship between the structure and the ground around it and the light that falls on it at different hours of the day. Delia followed and looked at each thing Ruth indicated and said very little. At the eastern window, Ruth paused. "If you ever needed to get into this cabin quickly and quietly," she said, "which window would you use?" Delia studied the options. She moved a few steps in each direction, looking at angles. She was taking her time, which was exactly correct. "Not this one," she said, indicating the eastern window. "It is too exposed from the tree line approach." "Why does that matter if you are moving quickly?" "Because if I am moving quickly, someone else may also be moving. And if they are watching the exposed approach, I want to use the one they are not watching." Ruth looked at her steadily for a moment. "The back window northwest corner," she said. "The latch is on the outside, which is unusual, but it opens inward if you knock in a specific pattern. 3 quick, 1 slow, 2 quick." Delia memorized this. Ruth could tell by the brief, still quality that came over her face the look of a person encoding information precisely. "Remember that," Ruth said. "You may need it." Then she told Delia to go back to the boarding house in town and stay there until she heard otherwise, and Delia went without argument. Ruth watched her go, then went inside and put the kettle on and sat down at the kitchen table in the gathering dusk and thought about a piece of damp paper in a coat pocket and what Martin had known that she did not yet know and what the morning after tomorrow would look like. They came before dawn on the 4th day. She had been expecting them. She had been sitting in the chair beside the front window for 3 hours before she heard the first sound that was not the wind or a night bird or the natural settling of a cold structure against the cold ground. It was a horse far out, being walked rather than ridden. Its hooves muffled by something cloth-wrapped or soft ground, but not entirely silent, because nothing is entirely silent if you know how to listen. She heard it once, then nothing, then a different direction, then nothing again. They were placing themselves in the pattern she had anticipated, north of the barn, using the tree line as cover. West of the garden, where the fence posts gave the illusion of concealment without providing much actual cover, which told her whoever had chosen those positions had looked at a map of her property but had not walked it in daylight. And someone, she thought, on the ridge itself elevated a watcher position or a shooter position depending on what was called for. She did not move from the chair. She sat with the rifle across her knees and her breathing slow and counted her heartbeats and thought about nothing in particular, which was a discipline she had learned at 23 years old in a war that had required it. The clock on the mantelpiece marked 5 in the morning, then 5:15, then 5:30, and the first gray suggestion of light began to define the eastern ridge, not dawn yet, but the announcement of it, the sky doing what the sky does when it is preparing to show itself. At 5:47, 3 knocks at the front door. Deliberate knocks, measured. The knocks of a man who wanted to convey control, who understood that the first thing you establish in a situation like this is the pace, because the person who controls the pace controls everything that follows. "Mrs. Callahan," the voice was a baritone not unpleasant, trained to carry without shouting. "My name is Fletcher Crane. I apologize for the early hour." Ruth did not answer. She moved from the chair to the first of the 4 positions she had mapped out along the interior walls, positions chosen because each one gave her a clear angle on a different approach while keeping her inside the room behind solid log construction. From her new position, she could see the front door and the kitchen window, and in the mirror she had mounted at a specific angle on the far wall a partial reflection of the eastern approach to the cabin. She looked into the mirror and saw 2 men moving along the fence line toward the eastern window. They were moving quietly, and with the particular care of people who believed they were unobserved. They were not running. They were professionals, or close enough to professionals that the distinction would not matter in the next few minutes. "Mrs. Callahan," the voice at the door said again, still controlled, still patient. "I have a business proposition from Mr. Silas Pruitt regarding your property. I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss it with you." She watched the 2 men in the mirror reach the eastern window. One of them put his hand on the lower shutter and pushed experimentally, feeling for resistance. He found little, which was precisely the resistance she had calibrated that hinge to provide. She saw his posture change in the small mirror, the slight gathering of his weight toward his back foot that preceded a harder push. She counted. 1, 2. The man hit the shutter hard with his shoulder. The shutter moved inward approximately 4 inches, which was exactly as far as it could move before the bar she had dropped into place 2 days ago caught it. The force of his push had nowhere to go. It came back into his shoulder with everything he had put into it, and he stumbled backward off the low porch step and hit the frozen ground with a sound that she heard clearly from inside the cabin. She was already moving. She crossed the kitchen in 6 steps and positioned herself at the interior side of the back hallway, 3 feet from the trapdoor section, and she waited. The wait was less than 30 seconds. She heard the back door handle turning slowly, then the quiet sound of the door being pushed from outside against its bolt, then the thin whisper of the gap at the base of the door admitting a thread of cold air. Someone was testing the back entry, looking for the point of least resistance, which was exactly what she had intended them to find. The gap at the base of the door was very slightly larger than it should have been. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for a person who was looking for a way in. She heard the careful sound of a body lowering itself, trying the gap. Then a boot came through the space under the door, feeling for the floor. Then the boot found the floor and the weight shifted forward onto it and onto the specific 20 inches of flooring that she had prepared, and the floor went away. The sound was brief and not particularly dramatic. A short fall, the percussion of a body hitting packed earth, and then a sound that was not quite a cry, but was the sound a person makes when they have landed wrong and the breath has been knocked out of them. She heard someone outside say something low and urgent. Then silence. She did not go to the trapdoor. Not yet. She moved back to the front window position and looked through the narrow gap in the shutter and assessed. The man who had hit the eastern porch step was sitting up, which was good news, meaning he was not seriously injured. He was holding his shoulder and looking at the cabin with an expression she could read even from this distance, the expression of a man revising his assumptions. The 2 men who had been waiting near the garden fence had gone still when they heard the fall inside the cabin. They were looking at each other and then at the cabin and then at each other again, which was the behavior of people whose plan has just encountered something their plan had not included. Fletcher Crane had not moved from in front of the door. He stood on the porch with his hands at his sides and his head slightly tilted, listening. He was not looking at the cabin windows. He was not looking at his men. He was looking at the door with a focused, considering expression, the look of a man who is rapidly recalculating. That expression told Ruth more about Fletcher Crane than anything she had yet learned about him. Most men in his position would have already started shouting instructions. Most men would have reacted to the fall inside the cabin with movement aggression, the instinct to push forward when the original approach fails. Crane was doing the opposite. He was standing still and thinking. She had been told he was a former officer. She believed it now. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, and his voice had changed in a way that was subtle but real, a slight flattening of the courtesy, the first acknowledgement that the situation was not proceeding according to the original estimate. "Someone has fallen through your floor. I would appreciate knowing whether that person needs medical attention." Ruth said nothing. She moved to another position, the one beside the kitchen wood stove, and she looked through the secondary mirror at the northern approach. There were 2 more men there. One of them was carrying a short rifle across his chest, muzzle down, not pointed at anything specific, but ready to point in a second. The other was watching the tree line to the northeast with more attention than he was watching the cabin, which told her he was nervous about what might be behind him. Good. Nervous men make small mistakes, and small mistakes compound. "Mrs. Callahan," Crane again, still on the porch, not moving. "I am going to be direct with you. We are here because Silas Pruitt has asked us to be here. He wants this land. He has asked us to encourage you to sell. I am not here to hurt anyone, and I would prefer this to end with a conversation and a fair price." Ruth picked up the rifle and checked it, though she had checked it 4 times already that night. The check was not for the rifle. It was for herself, the last calibration of intention before intention became action. She said clearly enough to be heard through the door, "You have men at 3 positions around my cabin. You have someone through my floor. This is not how people who want a conversation arrive." A pause. Then, "You knew we were there." "I have known for 4 days." Another pause longer. She heard very quietly the sound of Crane exhaling. "Then you are better prepared than we were told to expect," he said. "Most people are better prepared than you expect," Ruth said, "when you underestimate them." She kept 3 men outside and 1 man in her floor for the better part of an hour. The one on the floor was a young man named Tommy Vetch, and she found that out when she finally dropped a rope down through the trapdoor and told him to tie it to his wrist and she would pull him out. He told her his name without being asked, which was what people do when they are shaken and relieved and need to re-establish themselves as a person rather than a problem. She got him out of the cellar and walked him limping but mobile to the storage room off the kitchen, and sat him in the chair she had placed there the day before, and looped a length of cord around the chair legs and his ankles firmly, but without cruelty. He was perhaps 23. Brown hair, a face that had not quite settled into its adult shape, yet still carrying something of the boy in the set of the jaw. He was nursing a wrist he had landed on, badly rotating it with the experimental care of a person checking whether the pain is the temporary kind or the permanent kind. Ruth sat on an overturned crate across from him and looked at him for a moment without speaking. "Is it broken?" she asked. "Don't think so," he said. He looked at her with an expression that was trying to be defiant and not quite managing it. "You built that on purpose?" "Yes." "How long has that been there?" 2 years. He looked at the floor and then at the ceiling and then at his wrist and then at her. "Mr. Crane said this would be simple work, quiet work. Most people who hire others to do things they are not willing to do themselves describe it that way," Ruth said. He was quiet for a moment. "He's not a bad man," he said, and she could hear in his voice the particular defensiveness of someone who has tied his circumstances to another person and is uncomfortable examining that choice clearly. He is just doing what he was hired to do. "I am not arguing with you about Fletcher Crane," Ruth said. She kept her voice entirely level, without judgment or impatience, because she had learned a long time ago that a person who feels judged stops talking, and right now she wanted him to talk. "I am asking about you. You told me your name is Tommy Vetch. Who are you when you are not here?" The question landed in a way she had intended it to. He looked at her with a momentary confusion, the confusion of someone who has been asked an unexpected question about themselves in the middle of a situation that was supposed to be about something else entirely. "I have a girl," he said after a moment. Not proudly but carefully, the way you say something that matters when you are not sure you should be saying it. "Back in Rawlins. We are supposed to be married in the spring." Ruth looked at him steadily. "Does she know where you are?" He looked at the floor. "No." "Does she know what kind of work you have been doing?" He did not answer that one. Ruth sat with the silence for a moment. Then she said, "There is going to be a point in the next several hours when you will have a choice to make. I am not going to tell you what that choice will be or what the right answer is, because that is not something anyone can tell another person. What I am telling you is that the choice will come, and when it does, I want you to think about the girl in Rawlins before you make it." Tommy Vetch looked at her with an expression she had seen before, the expression of a young man who has received information that he does not yet have the framework to process, but that has gone in somewhere and will work on him. She stood up. "Your wrist is not broken," she said. "It will hurt for a week. Try not to put weight on it." She went back to the front of the cabin. Outside, the standoff had settled into a pattern that Ruth recognized and had planned for. Crane and his remaining men had drawn back to more defensible positions, which told her that the surprise of what had happened at the windows and the floor had registered as data, and the data was being processed. This was the period where the arithmetic changed. Going in had looked like one kind of problem. It now looked like a different kind of problem, and the recalculation was happening in real time. She used that period. She moved through the cabin in a slow circuit room to room, touching each position lightly, checking angles of light as the morning came fully in and changed the shadows. The frost on the outside of the windows was melting, which was changing the quality of reflection in the mirrors she had mounted. She adjusted 2 of them by small fractions. Through the gap in the front shutter, she watched Crane. He had positioned himself behind the large juniper at the edge of the cleared ground, about 40 feet from the porch. He was speaking quietly with a man beside him, another of the group she had not yet accounted for. She could see by their posture that they were disagreeing about something. The other man kept gesturing toward the cabin. Crane kept shaking his head. He was the one she had to focus on. Not because he was the most dangerous, though he may well have been, but because he was the one making the decisions. If she could shift his thinking, she could shift the entire situation. If she could not shift his thinking, she would be dealing with an escalation on his schedule rather than her own. She made herself wait until he gave her an opening. He gave it to her after about 20 minutes. "Mrs. Callahan," he called. And there was something slightly different in his voice now, a quality of acknowledgement that had not been there before, the voice of a man who has revised his assessment and is not pretending otherwise. "I think we have both established that this situation is more complicated than either of us initially presented. I would like to speak plainly, if you are willing." "I have been speaking plainly since you knocked on my door," Ruth said. A brief pause. "You knew my name before I told it to you. I know a great deal about you, Mr. Crane. I have had 3 years to learn what I needed to know about the people associated with Silas Pruitt's operation in this territory. Then you know I am not Pruitt's man in the way some of the others are. I am contracted work. There is a difference." "There is a legal difference," Ruth said. "There is less of a moral one." She heard him make a sound that was not quite a laugh, something shorter and more rueful. "You are not wrong about that," he said. She moved to a new position at the side window and looked at him from a different angle. He was still behind the juniper, but he had shifted his weight in a way that was less aggressive, more considered. He was not looking at the cabin like a target anymore. He was looking at it the way a man looks at a problem he is reconsidering. This was the moment she had been moving toward since she first identified him. She said, "Mr. Crane, I am going to tell you something, and I want you to listen to all of it before you respond." He said nothing, which she took as assent. "Silas Pruitt has a son," she said. "He does not acknowledge this. He has never acknowledged it because the woman he fathered this child with was a woman he had no legal or social obligation to, a woman he could afford to pretend had never mattered to him. When she came to him after the child was born and asked him to acknowledge the boy, he made arrangements to ensure that she could not embarrass him. Those arrangements were not kind." She heard the quality of the silence outside change. "The boy grew up without a father's name," she continued. "He made his own way. He became, by some accounts, a capable man, an officer during the war, a man of some reputation." She paused deliberately. "He became eventually the kind of man that Silas Pruitt could hire to do his difficult work, because that man's name was not Pruitt, and so the connection was invisible." The silence continued. She watched Crane through the gap in the shutter. He had gone very still, in the way of a person who has stopped listening to their surroundings because they are hearing something inside themselves that requires all their attention. The woman's name, Ruth said, was Eleanor Crane. She died in Laramie in 1864 of a fever that the doctor she could not afford to properly treat might have prevented. Fletcher Crane did not move for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all the careful control of the previous hour. Not loudly. It had not gotten louder. It had gotten quieter and more stripped of everything that was not essential to the sentence he needed to say. "You are telling me," he said, "that Pruitt is my father." "I am telling you what Martin Callahan's investigation found," Ruth said. "My husband documented it along with everything else he found about Pruitt's operation. He was a thorough man. He did not only document the land fraud, he documented the human cost of how Pruitt built what he built." Another silence. "Why are you telling me this now?" Crane asked. "Because you are standing in front of my cabin at the instruction of a man who destroyed your mother," Ruth said. "And I think you are the kind of person who needs to know that before he decides what to do next." From behind the juniper, she heard something that might have been a breath or might have been something else. She waited. Then, from somewhere back in the tree line to the east, a sound she had not expected. At that precise moment, a short, sharp cry that was cut off quickly. She moved to the eastern mirror in 2 steps. In the mirror's angled reflection, she saw a figure at the edge of the tree line being held from behind by a man whose face she recognized from the descriptions she had been given months ago. Breckin Farr. Pruitt's man, not Crane's. The one who had been watching the property from the ridge for the past 4 days. The one who had arrived not with Crane's group, but separately from a different direction at a different hour. The figure he was holding was Delia Marsh. She had come, Ruth understood immediately, the way she had been told to come if something was wrong. The boarding house, the landlady, the message that would have told her to stay put. Something had gone wrong with that message, or Delia had not received it, or she had received it, and had come anyway because she had looked out the window of the boarding house and seen something that told her she was needed. She had come in from the east, which was the route through the trees, which was the route she would have taken if she was trying to avoid the road. She had come in quietly and carefully, and she had run directly into Breckin Farr. Ruth assessed the situation in the 3 seconds it took her to cross the kitchen. Farr was holding Delia with one arm across her shoulders from behind. He had a revolver in his right hand. He was pulling her backward toward the tree line rather than forward toward the cabin, which told her he was not using her as direct leverage in the immediate standoff. He was taking her away. He intended to use her differently somewhere where Crane's group could not observe the arrangement. That meant she had a narrow window of time. She went to the back window, the northwest corner window, and looked out. Farr's angle was away from her current position. He was focused on Delia and on the tree line behind him and on not being seen from the front of the cabin. He had made a judgment about where the threat was and was managing his exit accordingly. He had made the same mistake all of them had made. He was thinking about where the threat was. He was not thinking about where Ruth Callahan could be. She moved. She went out the back window, the northwest corner, without a sound, dropping the last 2 feet to the frost-hard ground, with her weight already forward, already moving. She came around the north corner of the cabin at a walk, not a run, because running changes your breathing and changes your shooting, and she did not have a margin for either. She saw Farr 15 yards ahead, still moving backward, nearly to the tree line. Delia had stopped trying to struggle, which was smart of her. She had gone heavy and passive and was making herself as much of a burden as she could. Ruth raised the rifle. She said with the calm and clarity of a woman speaking to someone in the next room, "Breckin Farr." He froze. He could not see where the voice was coming from because she was not where any reasonable calculation of the situation would have placed her. "Let her go," Ruth said, "or the next sound you hear will be the last one." He turned slowly in the way of a man trying to locate a threat without giving anything away by turning, and when he found her, with his eyes, she watched the calculation happen behind them. The distance, the angle, the rifle she was holding, and the steadiness with which she was holding it. He released Delia. Delia moved. She did not run toward Ruth. She moved sideways away from Farr, away from the direct line between the two of them, and she put a tree between herself and him, which was exactly what she should have done, and Ruth noted it without showing anything. Farr stood at the tree line with his revolver at his side and looked at Ruth with the expression of a man who has just been reduced to one option. "Put it on the ground," Ruth said. He did. "Kick it toward me." He kicked it. It slid across the frozen ground and stopped about 6 feet from her. "Now sit down," she said, "with your back against that pine and your hands where I can see them." He sat. She looked at him for a moment longer. He was a medium-sized man of about 50 with the kind of face that had been lived in hard and had not aged gracefully because of it. He had been with Pruitt for a long time. She knew that from the records. She knew a great deal about Breckin Farr, most of it useful and none of it favorable. She reached down, picked up his revolver, and turned it in her hand once before setting it into her coat pocket. Then she looked at him with the particular quality of attention that made people feel measured and found wanting. "You are going to stay there," she said, "because the alternative is that I shoot you, and I would prefer not to, and I believe you are experienced enough to know that I am not saying that for your benefit." Farr looked at her. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the distance between himself and the nearest cover, which she had already calculated, and which he was now calculating, and he arrived at the same number she had. He sat down against the pine. Delia emerged from behind her tree and fell in step beside her, without being asked close enough that Ruth could hear her breathing, which was fast but controlled. She was frightened and was managing it, which was all you could ask of someone who had just been grabbed from behind by a stranger with a gun. "Are you hurt?" Ruth asked. "No." "I told you to stay in town." "I know," Delia said. "I came because Mrs. Osgood's boy came back from the North Road at first light and said he had seen men crossing the ridge trail, a lot of them more than the 6 or 8 that were being talked about. I thought you needed to know." Ruth considered this. More men than expected. How many? The boy said 10, maybe 12. He was not certain. It was still dark. Ruth kept walking. Did he say whether any of them looked different from the others, separated from the group? Delia thought. He said one man came in from the South Road alone, not with the others. Better dressed, he said, like a town man. Ruth stopped walking. She stood in the frozen yard between the tree line and her cabin with the rifle in her hands, and the morning coming fully over the ridge now, clear and cold and indifferent, and she looked at the juniper bush where Fletcher Crane was standing and thought about what it meant that someone had come from the South Road alone before dawn, dressed like a town man. Pruitt. Not Crane, not Farr, Pruitt himself. She had not expected him here. She had expected him in Denver, in his office at a safe distance, sending word through intermediaries, the way powerful men manage their worst arrangements. She had constructed this entire situation on the assumption that Pruitt would remain where he was comfortable, which was behind other people. She realized with a cold clarity, made an assumption that was built on what she knew about powerful men in general, and had not accounted for what was specific about this particular powerful man, which was that the federal commission was coming in March, and what she represented to him was not a property dispute, but an existential threat. And existential threats have a way of making men behave in ways they otherwise would not. He had come himself because he needed to be certain. She walked to the front of the cabin and looked at Crane still behind his juniper. "Your employer has arrived," she said, "from the South Road, about 15 minutes ago by my estimate." She watched Crane's expression and learned from it again the thing about him that she had been learning in pieces since he had first spoken from her porch. He had not known Pruitt was coming. "He did not tell you," she said. Not a question. "No," Crane said. Ruth stood in the cleared ground in front of her cabin with the morning light laying itself across the frost and the pines and the distant ridge, and she looked at Fletcher Crane, who was a man standing in front of the cabin of the woman whose husband his unknowing father had ordered killed, doing work his unknowing father had paid for. And she felt something that was not pity and not judgment, but something more complicated than either. She said, "Mr. Crane, what I told you about your mother and about Pruitt is documented. My husband's documentation is precise. I have corroborating records from at least 2 other sources. If you wanted to know the truth of it beyond my word that truth exists and can be verified." Crane looked at her from behind the juniper. His face was doing the work of a man who has had the foundational premise of something important dismantled and is trying to determine what that means for every related structure. "Why are you telling me this?" he said again. The same question as before, but different now. Before it had been tactical, asking whether she had an angle. Now it was something more personal, the genuine confusion of a man trying to understand a kindness in the middle of a situation that had not contained any kindness until that moment. "Because knowing the truth about who you are and who you are working for is your right," Ruth said. "And because what happens in the next hour will be affected by what you decide to do with that truth. And because I believe, based on everything I have learned about you, that you are capable of deciding correctly." She looked past the juniper down the slope toward the south approach where the tree line was thick and still. "He will come from the south," she said. "That is where the road is, and that is where a man who has spent 30 years making other people do his difficult work will position himself. Far enough back to stay safe, close enough to observe." She looked back at Crane. "When he comes," she said, "you will have to decide something. I cannot make that decision for you, but I think you already know what it is." She turned and went back into the cabin. Inside, she moved through the rooms with the quick, economical efficiency of someone who has reached the final part of a long process and can feel the weight of everything prior falling away behind her. She checked the remaining positions. She looked at the mirror network. She calculated angles and distances and the way the morning light was now falling across the eastern approach, and she found that everything was as she had prepared it. She went to the storage room and looked in on Tommy Vetch. He was sitting as she had left him. The wrist he had landed on was propped on his knee. He looked up when she came in. "Something's changed," he said. "People who have been held in one room during a conflict develop a sensitivity to the quality of sound outside it." He had heard the tonal shift in the voices outdoors, and he had read it correctly. "Something has changed," she confirmed. "Onto the north side of the property." "If onto the north side of the property. If you go through it and move along the fence line north, you will reach the Millhaven Trail in about a quarter mile. The trail goes east and will bring you out above Cedar Bluff in about 3 hours." He stared at her. "You are letting me go." "I am giving you the option," she said. "You are not a man who intended to be here doing this. You were told it was something simpler than it is, and you came because the money was useful, and you needed money, and that is the kind of choice that men make when they are young, and the world has not yet shown them what it can cost." She stood up. "Go back to Rollins," she said. "Get married in the spring, when a federal investigator eventually comes around asking questions about Pruitt's operation, which they will answer them honestly. That is how you turn this into something you can live with." Tommy Vetch looked at her for a long moment. He looked like a man who was trying to find something to say and had discovered that nothing in his current vocabulary was adequate. He stood up carefully, favoring the bruised wrist. "Who are you?" he said, not hostilely, with a genuine and slightly awed curiosity. "A woman who made some hard choices a long time ago and learned something from them," Ruth said. "Now go." He went. Delia had come inside through the northwest window as she had been told. She was sitting at the kitchen table when Ruth came back in from the storage room, her hands around a cup of water she had helped herself to, and she looked at Ruth with the expression of someone who has recently been grabbed from behind in the woods by a man with a gun and is processing the fact that she's now sitting in a warm kitchen. "Who is the man sitting against the pine tree?" she asked. "His name is Farr. He works directly for Pruitt, not Crane. Is he going to stay sitting there for a while?" Delia looked at the table. Then she said quietly, "The piece of paper, the one from under the floor. I have the coat in my bag. I brought it because you told me not to throw it away." Ruth stopped moving. Delia reached to the bag she had dropped near the door and brought out a worn canvas coat, faded brown, the kind of working coat that is bought for use rather than appearance. She reached into the left inside pocket and brought out a piece of paper that had been folded into quarters and was soft at the folds from moisture, the kind of soft that means it had been wet and then dried many times. She held it out. Ruth took it with both hands. She unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something that might not hold together through another opening. It was a map. Small hand drawn, the lines precise, in the way of someone trained to record spatial information accurately. She recognized the style of the lines immediately, the economy of them, the way important information was marked with the minimum notation required to be unambiguous. Martin's hand. She would have known it through walls. There was a circle, and inside the circle, 2 letters, MC, and an arrow pointing northeast, and a word written very small beneath the arrow. The word was Greystone. Ruth stood in her kitchen with the paper in both hands and the morning light coming through the window, and a standoff still in progress outside her cabin, and she was entirely still for a very long time. 3 years. 3 years of searching the land and the records and the people and every surface Martin had ever touched in this territory. He had not hidden it in any of those places. He had put it in the one place that Silas Pruitt could never search, that no one could search without drawing attention, that would be there when she finally thought to look. He had put it in the ground. He had put it in his own grave in the Greystone Cemetery, and he had left a map in a place along his last known route that she would eventually find if she kept looking long enough and carefully enough, because he knew her, because he had always known how she worked, because after 22 years of marriage he understood the shape of her thinking in the same fundamental way she understood his. He had trusted her to find it. She had found it. She folded the map back along its original lines and put it in the inside pocket of her coat next to the letter she always carried. She looked out the kitchen window at the south approach where the tree line was thick and where a man who had spent 30 years building an empire on other people's silence was, if her calculation was right, arriving to oversee the final removal of the last thing standing in his way. She thought of Martin in the ground in Greystone, with the evidence of Pruitt's crimes buried alongside him, the most patient and deliberate act of defiance she had ever heard of, and she felt something rise in her chest that was grief and pride and love and fury all so tightly bound together that she could not have separated them if she had tried. She did not try. She turned to Delia, who was watching her with quiet and complete attention. "There is a signal I need to send to Sheriff Dale," Ruth said. "When I fire 3 shots in sequence close together, he will come. He is already on the road. I sent him a letter 3 days ago." Delia nodded. "Until then," Ruth said, "I need you to stay in this room. Not because you cannot help, but because I need to know exactly where you are." Delia looked at her steadily. She had the look of someone who has understood in the last 2 hours that the woman she has been spending time with is not who she appeared to be, and is working out how she feels about that, and has arrived at the conclusion that she feels all right about it. "All right," she said. Ruth picked up the rifle. Outside, the morning had come all the way in, clear and cold and bright as a blade, and somewhere in the tree line to the south, a careful man was moving toward her cabin for the last time, not knowing what had been built here, not knowing what was waiting, not knowing that the woman he had sent men to remove had spent 3 years turning his certainty into a trap. She thought of Delia sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of water. She thought of Tommy Vetch heading north through the cold timber toward a life that still had the shape of something worth living. She thought of Martin's handwriting on a piece of damp paper that had almost been thrown away. She picked up the rifle and went to her position. She heard him before she saw him, not his footsteps. Silas Pruitt was not a man who walked into difficult situations ahead of other men. She heard the particular quality of silence that preceded him, the way the remaining men outside the cabin went still when someone with authority over them entered the perimeter. It was the silence of people adjusting their posture without being told to the involuntary straightening that happens in the presence of a man who has spent decades making other people conscious of their position relative to his. She moved to the south window and looked through the narrow gap in the shutter. He was standing at the edge of the cleared ground, perhaps 60 feet from the porch. He was wearing a good coat, dark wool, the kind of coat that says its wearer has not needed to worry about the cost of keeping warm for a very long time. He was older than the photographs she had studied, which was to be expected after 3 years, but the quality she had identified in those photographs was still present and recognizable. It was the quality of a man who had never in his adult life been required to explain himself to anyone who had real power over him, and who had consequently lost the habit of uncertainty. He had 2 men with him. They stood a step behind, and to either side the positioning of escort rather than partnership. They were there to manage his physical safety. His decisions were entirely his own. He looked at the cabin for a moment with the assessing eye of a man looking at a property he intends to acquire, which Ruth understood was probably a reflex, so old and automatic he no longer noticed it. Then he looked at Fletcher Crane, who had come out from behind the juniper when the new arrivals crossed the southern tree line, and the look that passed between them told Ruth everything she needed to know about the nature of their arrangement. Crane was a contractor, Pruitt was an employer. The distance between those two things was the distance between a man who might be reasoned with and a man who had long since moved past the need for reason. Pruitt raised his voice. It carried easily in the cold morning air. "Mrs. Callahan, my name is Silas Pruitt. I believe you know who I am." Ruth said nothing. She moved to the next position along the interior wall, the one that gave her the best angle on the south approach while keeping the kitchen window in her peripheral view. "I am going to speak plainly," Pruitt said. "I have been in this territory for 31 years. I have built something here. I have built it through work and investment and an understanding of how land and money and political reality function together. I am not a man who apologizes for his methods because the men who built this country did not build it by apologizing for their methods." He paused. "Your husband understood some of what I have built. He was a capable man. I respected his capability even as I found his presence inconvenient." Ruth kept still. "He is gone," Pruitt said. "That is a fact that cannot be changed. What can be changed is what happens next. The Federal Commission arrives in March. I am prepared to make arrangements that will satisfy their inquiry. I have made similar arrangements before. What I cannot have is a woman with access to whatever Martin Callahan may have left behind speaking to that commission before those arrangements are in place." He stopped. The cleared ground was very quiet. "I am not offering to buy your land," he said. "I am offering you the opportunity to take your horse and your belongings and leave this territory before the end of the week. You will be compensated. You will not be followed. You will live your life wherever you choose to live it, and this chapter will close." Ruth looked at him through the gap in the shutter, at this man in his good coat standing in the frost of her cleared ground, and she felt the full weight of what he had just said settle through her. He was not here for the land. He had never been here for the land. The land was incidental, a cover story that worked well enough for the men he hired because men like Fletcher Crane could work a land dispute without asking too many questions. The real purpose, the purpose that had brought Pruitt himself out of his warm office in Denver and onto a cold Wyoming road before dawn, was silence. Her silence specifically. The silence of the last person who could connect him not only to the fraud of his land dealings, but to the death of the man who had been documenting it. She understood now why he had waited 3 years. He had waited because he had men searching for what Martin had left behind, and as long as those men were searching, there was a possibility that whatever Martin had hidden would be found and destroyed before it could be used. The Federal Commission had ended that waiting period. He could not keep searching and also manage the commission. He had to choose. He had chosen to remove the person rather than continue searching for the document. He did not know that she had found the document 12 minutes ago. She took a breath and moved to the front window. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. Her voice came out as she intended it, level and without theater. "You said you would speak plainly. So will I." He waited. "My husband's investigation documented your land fraud from 1864 to the present. It documented the bribes paid to the Territorial Land Office. It documented the coercion of officials who refused payment. It documented the deaths of homesteaders whose refusals created problems for your acquisition schedule." She paused one beat. "And it documented the arrangement you made regarding my husband's own death." The quality of the silence outside changed. "That documentation exists," she said. "It is not in this cabin. It is not in Cedar Bluff. It is somewhere that your men have not searched and will not think to search, and it is in a condition that will survive until the Federal Commission arrives in March and receives it." She watched Pruitt's face through the shutter gap. He was not a man whose face gave much away, but there are limits to what self-control can accomplish when a foundational assumption collapses. He had come here certain that the document did not exist, or that if it existed, it was inaccessible, or that if it was accessible, she did not yet know where it was. 3 years of his men finding nothing had built that certainty. She had just taken it apart. "Furthermore," Ruth said, I have already been in communication with Judge Aldous Terriol in Cheyenne, who has been informed of the general nature of what Martin's investigation uncovered. The communication I sent him last week requested that he make himself available to receive documentation from Sheriff Emmett Dale of Cedar Bluff no later than the 15th of this month. She let that settle. If I do not send Sheriff Dale a message by the morning of the 14th indicating that all is well, she said, he has been instructed to ride to Cheyenne with what he has and make his own account of events here. What he has is not the full documentation. But it is enough to open an inquiry, and an inquiry, as you know better than most, has a way of finding things that were meant to stay hidden. Pruitt looked at the cabin for a long moment. She watched him do the arithmetic. She had spent 3 years making sure the arithmetic came out the way she needed it to come out, and she was reasonably certain it was coming out that way now. But she was also aware that a man who had built 30 years of power in a territory was not a man who accepted arithmetic calmly when it was working against him. He turned slightly and said something low to the man on his right. Ruth moved. She crossed to the north window in 4 steps and looked out at the approach. The man Pruitt had spoken to was moving toward the tree line to the north, not toward the cabin. Moving quietly, moving with the specific purpose of someone who has been given a route and a destination. She raised the rifle and fired once into the ground 2 feet ahead of his next step. The crack of the shot in the cold air was enormous. The man stopped. He did not look around for cover. He stood exactly where he was, which was the behavior of someone who understood that whoever had just fired had chosen not to hit him and was making a specific point. "That man is not going anywhere," Ruth said, her voice carrying easily through the window. "No one is going anywhere except through the front approach in plain sight until Sheriff Dale arrives. He is on the road now. He will be here within the hour." She watched Pruitt in the south window mirror. He had turned at the shot, and now he was looking at the cabin with the expression of a man who has run a calculation and arrived at an answer he does not care for. Then, from behind the juniper, Fletcher Crane spoke. His voice was different from what it had been in the previous hours. It had lost the careful, professional neutrality he had maintained since he first knocked on her door. It was quieter and more personal and considerably more dangerous. "Pruitt," he said, "not Mr. Pruitt. Just the name with the particular weight of a man saying a word that has changed meaning for him." Pruitt turned. "My mother's name was Eleanor Crane," Fletcher said. "She died in Laramie in 1864. The cleared ground was completely still. "I would like to know," Fletcher Crane said, in the voice of a man asking a question he has already answered for himself, "whether you knew who you were hiring when you contracted my outfit for this job." Pruitt looked at him. Ruth watched both men and said nothing. "Yes," Pruitt said finally. The word came out with less control than anything else he had said, which told Ruth it was the most honest thing he had said. Crane absorbed this. "You hired your own son," he said, "to remove a woman who can prove you had her husband killed." "The sentiment is understandable," Pruitt said, and there was something almost clinical in his tone, the voice of a man attempting to reframe a situation by removing its emotional content. "But sentiment and circumstance are different categories." "They are," Crane said. "You are right about that." He stepped out from behind the juniper, and Ruth watched him walk across the cleared ground toward Pruitt with the measured pace of a man who has made a decision and is past the point of reconsidering it. He stopped 6 feet away. "I am done with this contract," he said. "I am done with you. When the federal commission arrives, I will give them whatever account of your operations they require." Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. His face did the work of a powerful man, encountering an outcome he had not designed, and finding that his usual methods of addressing such outcomes were not available to him. He said nothing. It was the most complete thing he could have done. Emmett Dale arrived 53 minutes later with 2 deputies and a warrant that he had obtained from the circuit judge in Rawlins 4 days prior at Ruth's written request on the basis of the preliminary evidence she had provided him. He was a thorough man. He had done what she asked of him, and he had done it without asking for more explanation than she gave, which was the quality she had relied on from the first week she arrived in Cedar Bluff and had taken his measure across a general store counter. He dismounted in front of the cabin and looked at the assembled situation with the careful eyes of a man who has arrived at a scene that is more complicated than the briefing suggested. Ruth came out onto the porch. "Silas Pruitt," Dale said, looking at the man in the good coat. "I know who you're looking for," Ruth said. "He is standing there. Breckenfar is against the pine on the north side of the property. The man at the north tree line is one of Pruitt's escort. The two men by the garden fence are Crane's people, and they have indicated they will cooperate." Dale looked at her. "Tommy Vetch," she said. "He left through the North Trail about 2 hours ago. He is a young man who made a poor choice that he is going to unmake. I would appreciate it if when you locate him, you treat him accordingly." Dale nodded slowly. Then he gestured to his deputies, and they began the work of securing the situation. Fletcher Crane did not resist. He walked to Dale's deputy with his hands visible and his face carrying the look of a man doing something that costs him, but that he has decided is the correct price to pay. He would face a legal accounting for the things he had done. Ruth understood that and did not pretend otherwise. What she also understood was that what he did in the next several months, the account he gave the testimony. He provided the completeness of his cooperation would matter in ways that the specific charges against him could not fully capture. She had told him the truth about who he was and who he had been working for. What he did with that truth was his to determine. Pruitt was taken into custody with a stillness that was almost worse than resistance. He did not argue. He did not negotiate. He looked at the deputies and then at Ruth with the expression of a man filing away information for future use, which was the expression of a man who had not yet understood that the future he was filing information toward no longer existed in the form he imagined it. He would understand that when he saw what Martin had left, which meant she had to go to Greystone. She rode out that afternoon alone. Dale had offered to send a deputy with her. She had declined. This was not something she wanted witnessed. It was not something she wanted accompanied or observed or commented upon. It was something she needed to do in the way that a person needs to do certain things privately without the softening effect of other people's presence. Greystone was a small settlement 12 miles south of Cedar Bluff, smaller than Cedar Bluff, and older, the kind of place that had existed before the territory had a proper name and had continued existing out of the accumulated inertia of the families who had decided to stay. It had a church and a cemetery behind the church, and the cemetery had in it under a stone. She had chosen herself and paid for herself and read the inscription on herself with the specific awful finality of a person reading words cut into rock the grave of Martin Callahan. Federal land agent, beloved husband, faithful servant of the truth. She had written that last line herself. At the time she had written it because it was accurate. Now, standing in front of the stone in the thin November light, she understood that it was more accurate than she had known when she wrote it. Emmett Dale had been at Greystone ahead of her as she had arranged. He had done what needed doing and had left as she had asked. The earth beside the stone had been carefully replaced. On top of the replaced earth, set precisely in the center, was a leather document case, water-stained and soft at the edges, sealed with the clasp that Martin had used for his official correspondence, the clasp she would have recognized in any condition. She picked it up. She did not open it immediately. She held it in both hands and looked at the stone for a moment, at his name cut into the gray Wyoming rock, and she breathed the cold air and let the quiet of the cemetery settle around her. Then she sat down on the ground beside the grave the way she had done many times before, and she opened the case. Inside was the documentation, all of it, everything Martin had assembled in the last year of his life, organized with the meticulous care of a man who understood that the work he was doing would outlast him and needed to be complete enough to stand without his presence to explain it. Land records showing the original filings and the fraudulent amendments. Financial records tracing the payments from Pruitt's accounts to the territorial officials who had processed those amendments. Sworn statements from 2 officials who had since been replaced and one who, as far as Ruth knew, was still in his position in Rawlins. Correspondence, some of it in copies made in Martin's hand and some of it in original documents whose acquisition Ruth did not ask herself too many questions about between Pruitt and his various agents. And at the very back of the case, in an envelope sealed with wax that had been pressed with Martin's personal seal rather than his official one, a letter. She recognized the seal. She had watched him use it. She had a memory very clear and sudden of him sitting at the kitchen table of their house in Virginia 11 years ago, pressing that seal into red wax on a letter to his brother, and the precise look of concentration on his face as he did it. She broke the seal carefully. She unfolded the letter. It was dated October 14, 1879, 12 days before Martin died. She read it. She read it slowly, the way you read something that you want to understand entirely, not just receive, but comprehend at every level. The morning light shifted as she read. A bird crossed the sky above the cemetery, and she did not look up. When she finished, she sat with the letter in her lap and the document case beside her and the stone in front of her, and she was still for a very long time. Martin had known for 12 days that Pruitt intended to have him killed. He had known because a source inside the land office, a young clerk named Baines, who had subsequently left the territory, had sent him a warning in early October. He had received the warning and had made his choices in response to it. He had not run. He had not sent word to his superiors asking for protection. He had spent those 12 days completing the documentation, organizing it, and finding a location for it that satisfied two requirements simultaneously. It had to be somewhere Pruitt's men could not search without drawing attention, and it had to be somewhere Ruth would eventually look if she kept looking long enough and knew him well enough. He had chosen his own grave because it was the only location that met both requirements. He had arranged for the documentation to be placed there through Baines, who had agreed to do this one thing before leaving the territory because he was a young man with a conscience that had not yet been entirely overwritten by fear. Martin had then continued his work and his life for the remaining days, knowing what was coming, and had not told her. He had not told her because he knew what she would do if he told her. He knew she would stay. He knew she would not leave him to face it alone, and he knew that if she stayed, Pruitt would eventually use her as a means of extracting information that Martin had been very careful to keep from him. The documentation's location above all. He had protected the documentation by keeping it entirely within himself, and he had protected her by keeping her outside the knowing. The letter ended with a paragraph that she read 3 times. He had written, "I am sorry that I did not have the courage to tell you this in person. I am not sorry for the choice I made because I believe it was the right choice, and I believe you will understand that when you have had time to think about it with the clarity that time and distance provide. I know you will be angry. You have every right to be angry, but I also know you, Ruth and I know that what you will do with this when you find it will be worth what it cost to leave it here. You are the most capable person I have ever known. I have always been very proud to be your husband." She sat beside his grave in the cold afternoon light. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the first weeks in the cabin in Cedar Bluff, alone in the dark. The crying that is about the specific physical absence of a person and has no language. What she felt now was different. It was the feeling of understanding arriving after a long journey, settling into its final place, and carrying with it both the weight of the truth and a strange and specific relief. He had trusted her to find it. He had built that trust into the very structure of his final act. Everything he had done in those last 12 days had been premised on his knowledge of her, his certainty that she would come, that she would look, that she would eventually look in the right place, because she understood him well enough to find the place that was right for him specifically. She had been angry for 3 years without knowing it. She had been carrying a grief that was tangled with an anger she could not name because she did not understand where it was directed. She understood it now. She had been angry at a death that she had experienced as abandonment, the abandonment of a person who had left without warning, without preparation, without the chance for any of the things that people need when they are about to lose each other. He had not left without preparation. He had prepared everything with more care and more love and more specific knowledge of her than she had given him credit for. She sat with that for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and without performance, the voice she used in this place with this person. "You were right that I would be angry," she said. "I was. I am still a little, but you were also right about the rest." She looked at the stone. "I found it," she said. "I found all of it. And I think Judge Terriol in Cheyenne is going to have a very interesting few months." The wind moved through the cemetery cold and clean. The last of the afternoon light lay across the stone and the frost and the dark earth, and it was very quiet. "I met a girl," Ruth said. "Young woman. Her name is Delia Marsh. Her family lost their land to Pruitt, same pattern, same methods. She came to me because she wanted to learn to protect herself." She paused. "I did not teach her what she asked to learn. I taught her something more useful. She picked it up faster than most people I have worked with, and I have worked with some capable people." She looked at her hands, which were holding the letter which she would keep. "I have been asked to lead a federal investigative unit, land fraud and corruption, in the territories. It is a significant responsibility. I told them I needed 6 months to prepare." She looked up at the stone. "I am going to prepare Delia Marsh in those 6 months," she said, "and then I am going to do the work, because there is more of it. Pruitt is not the only man who has built an empire on other people's silence. There are others, and they are watching what happens to him, and what they see is going to matter." She stood up. She brushed the cold from her coat. "You always said I was better at this than you were," she said. "I think that was modesty on your part, but I am going to spend the next considerable portion of my life proving you right anyway." She picked up the document case and held it under her arm. She looked at the stone one last time, at his name, and the words she had written, and she felt the full weight of 22 years of a life shared with another person, all of it the ordinary mornings and the difficult conversations, and the specific quality of his laugh, and the way he held his pen when he was concentrating, all of it present at once, in the way it only is when you are standing very close to loss and looking at it clearly. Then she turned and walked toward her horse. 2 months later, Ruth Callahan sat in the federal courtroom in Cheyenne and watched Silas Pruitt hear the 14 counts read aloud against him. He sat at the defendant's table with the stillness of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where other people did the waiting, and who was now learning, at 61 years of age, what waiting felt like from the inside. His attorney was a good one, the best available in the territory, and even the best available in the territory had spent the preceding 6 weeks trying to find a weakness in Martin Callahan's documentation, and had failed. The documentation was precise. Martin had been a thorough man. When the foreman read the verdict, Pruitt looked straight ahead. He did not look at Ruth. She had not expected him to. A man like Pruitt managed his losses by refusing to acknowledge their source, and she understood that for him to look at her would be to acknowledge something he had no framework to hold. She did not require his acknowledgement. She required his conviction, and she had it. Judge Theriot sentenced him the following morning, which was a Thursday in December, cold and gray, the kind of day that has no ceremony in it. Theriot read the sentence in the same flat, precise voice he used for everything which Ruth had come to understand was not lack of feeling, but the particular discipline of a man who believed that the law was diminished by theater. 22 years, fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of a federal agent. Pruitt was taken out a side door. Ruth watched him go and felt the weight of 3 years lift from her, the way a long-held breath releases, not dramatically, not in a rush, but in a slow and total easing that left her very still in her chair for a moment after the room had begun to move around her. Fletcher Crane's testimony had lasted 2 full days. He spoke without visible hesitation and with a specificity of detail that the federal attorneys found either remarkable or simply the behavior of a man who had been keeping his own records for a long time. His cooperation was noted. He was not absolved of the charges against him, which were real and which he did not dispute. But the nature of his sentence reflected a court's judgment that there is a difference between a man who builds a criminal enterprise and a man who is hired by one, and that the difference matters even when the actions are the same. He would serve time. When he came out, Ruth thought he would be a different kind of man than the one who had stood outside her cabin that October morning. Whether that was better or worse, she could not say. She suspected he could not say either, and that living with that uncertainty was itself a kind of sentence. Breckenfarr did not cooperate. His case was straightforward. Tommy Vetch came into the Cedar Bluff Sheriff's Office on a Tuesday in late November, voluntarily, which Ruth had thought he might. He was married the following spring, as he had intended to be. The Marsh family's land, along with 17 other parcels taken through Pruitt's fraudulent filings, was returned under a territorial court order In February, Delia was there when the papers were signed, sitting beside her mother in the clerk's office in Cedar Bluff, and she did not say much, which Ruth had come to understand was how Delia responded to things that mattered more than words could hold. Delia spent 6 months learning from Ruth in the cabin on the Cedar Bluff Ridge. She did not learn to shoot first, though Ruth taught her that, eventually toward the end. She learned to read a landscape the way a trained person reads it, to identify what is absent from a scene as readily as what is present, to document with precision and without premature interpretation, because interpretation benefits from documentation and not the other way around. She learned patience, not as waiting, but as the discipline of remaining uncertain long enough to see clearly. Ruth had known capable people in her life. She had worked beside them and trained alongside them and occasionally buried them, and she had formed a clear sense over 30 years of what made the difference between a capable person and an excellent one. It was not skill. Skills could be taught to almost anyone willing to work hard enough. It was the willingness to stay with what you did not yet understand, to resist the answer you expected, and remain with the evidence until it told you something you had not anticipated. Delia Marsh had that quality already. Ruth could only give it context and discipline and practice. She was not a finished thing at the end of those 6 months, but she was a beginning, and beginnings were what the territory needed. On the morning Ruth left Cedar Bluff for Cheyenne to assume her position with the Federal Investigative Unit, she rode past the cemetery at Greystone. She did not stop. She had said what she needed to say. She had made her peace with the shape of the truth, which was not the shape she had expected, but was she had come to understand the shape it needed to be in order to be true. She rode past at a walk and looked at the stone from the road at his name and the inscription she had written, without fully understanding how accurate it was, and she carried with her, as she would carry for the rest of her life, the knowledge of what Martin had done and what it had cost and what it had made possible. He had trusted her to find it. She had found it. The road to Cheyenne was long and cold and clear, the kind of day the high Wyoming country produces in winter, with a generosity that feels deliberate, the sky enormous above the pale ridges, the air sharp enough to make every outline precise. Ruth Callahan rode into it at a steady pace with the document case in her saddlebag and his letter in her coat, and she thought about work. There was more of it ahead. There was always more of it, and she had decided somewhere in the past 3 years that this was not a thing to mourn. The work was what remained when everything else had been stripped down to its essential form. The work was what she was good at, and being good at something necessary was as close to a reason as most people ever found. She rode on. The road went forward into the winter light, and she followed it, and she did not look back.